Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix, and welcome to my YouTube channel. I encourage you to check out my other videos on my YouTube channel, as well as like, subscribe, and share, as it helps me a lot and keeps you updated on content that I am releasing. Now, I'm Phoenix, and I do a lot of writing and compose music, and I write in a variety of fields. And I think a lot about aesthetic, specifically philosophically, about what my aesthetic is. Aesthetic is something that you can think about or that can arise naturally and organically out of your work, or maybe a little bit of both, but whatever it is, there is certainly an interesting way of talking about what that aesthetic is. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what my aesthetic is. Now, there are certainly a lot of ways that we could describe my aesthetic. I try to keep it open-ended for one thing. I try to limit any kind of what could be called an ideological boundary or something of that nature, a way in which I try to leave my writings, as an example, open-ended. And that is part of the reason why I write philosophy, why I write essays, but as well as poetry and fiction and plays, among other things. I do that in order to keep the constructions unbounded, so to speak. And sure, while we might be limited a little bit by language and the structure that we're using, there's a very real way in which I like to see it unbounded. Now, I went to college and I have my degree in English, and I really enjoyed taking the courses in my English degree. And one of the things that came out of that was a education on experimentalism, as well as an analysis of the avant-garde. And through time, I have kind of felt very conflicted about the goals and ambitions of the avant-garde, as well as been a little bit critical and skeptical of experimentalism. And there are reasons for that. Maybe I've been a little bit jaded by the process and jaded by the kind of culture that it creates, as an example. But there is a way in which I have still been very much influenced by it. And so I often, very specifically in my poetry, for example, I have a very formal quality to what I am writing. So, for example, I've been very influenced by conceptual poetry, as an example, where I kind of destabilize the context of what I'm writing. So it's not always literally what I'm saying, but the context itself that is way important. I've also been influenced a lot by the avant-garde, and that would include a lot of the prominent poets, as an example, but also writers, novelists, and philosophers of the 20th century and beyond to the 21st century. I've definitely been influenced by them. And it is something that I seek out in my writing, especially when I'm reading new books. I always try to keep it fresh and contemporary, at least in the context of thinking about kind of way of constructing my art. And so I find, for example, the avant-garde to be helpful in that way. And I do also break the rules a lot in my own writing. But even with that said, I would say that I also, on the opposite end of the spectrum, as it could be called, on the other pole, I have what could be called a classical influence. So in school, I also took classes on medieval literature, and medieval literature is less formal in a lot of ways than what you would find in 20th century modernism, as an example. I would say that even though writing had developed quite a bit at that point in the Middle Ages, there's still definitely a classical feel to it when you come to it in the 21st century. Medieval literature is not something that you would run into very commonly, with the exception of something like Tolkien, who had very medieval, Middle Age influences. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that I have a classical influence juxtaposed with a kind of experimental, avant-garde, advanced garde kind of influence. And that tension is very prominent in my writing. Now, I wanted to focus mostly on my aesthetic for my writing, but I would say that there are two modes, and I may have mentioned this before, but there are two modes that I am mostly influenced by, or, well, I wouldn't say mostly influenced by, but that influence me a lot, and outside of literature. And that would be philosophy, and the likes of people like Nietzsche, as well as even someone like Plato, and that juxtaposed with metal music, which I really, really enjoy for a variety of reasons. And those two modes of art influence me quite a bit, and I love that influence. And the reason why I chose those modes is because they were modes that fell outside of my more formal training. For instance, I never learned about metal music in school. The closest we ever talked to even about music was maybe classical music, such as by Bach or the Romantics, or something like punk, if we were talking about an influence of a writer. But it was definitely a rare thing. And I discovered philosophy mostly on my own, as well as metal music on my own, because I wanted to have that kind of freedom. I wanted to have the ability to open myself up and to have my own way of describing things, among many things. And so my aesthetic is definitely broad ranging in that way. There is a real way in which I care more about the possibilities of what I am writing and of even the ethical considerations such as inspiring other people by way of my work. And I do those things because it's a different vein from what you might get in another tradition. And I think that that's very important. I wanted to find my own way of composing these things. I wanted to find my own way of writing and thinking about art. And so that is something that I have done. One thing that I think is very important as a writer is constructing narratives. I think constructing narratives is a very important practice for understanding the world, for understanding ourselves. And one of the main values that I get from narrative is just the ability to use language to be able to tell a story. I think that we take that for granted because it's so common and because we are definitely hardwired to tell stories, and I think we take that for granted. But there is a lot of truth in something like The Power of Myth by Joseph Campbell, that myths influence us in a variety of ways, and they reveal deeper truths about our reality. And that is kind of how I perceive narrative and narrative structure. And of course, you can have the postmodern critique of narratives as not necessarily being ethical, as making the world a better place, or maybe have a postmodern critique about how narrative is very subjective and subject to infinite interpretations. And all of that is valid, but I think it is less important to what I'm trying to do. Because what I'm trying to do with my art, specifically my writing, is open up pathways, open up new possibilities, open up new ways of seeing the world. You can take that position to a much more extreme position and assume that it's actually to change our perceptions completely, to radically alter how we see the world, and that's probably helpful to a degree. But I don't necessarily go that far, only because I think narrative can also be enjoyable. I don't think it's always something that has to change things about our perceptions. I don't think that that is as important. So that is one of the powerful things that I see about narrative. And again, I would emphasize possibility. My theory of fiction is, again, as I've said, that narrative shows us life. My theory of poetry is that it's kind of a momentum. Specifically, some of the more what I could call radical pieces that I write are much more about movement and flow and using language in that way. And I find that to be a very powerful way of going about the world and going about writing and going about language. Because it really is a rhythm and beat. It's a movement. I mean, it depends on what you're writing. It could also be about narrative or about more formal structures. And I do have some of that, but I would say in general, my poetry is really about really expanding that rhythm and beat. And I'm not even talking about just literally in the poem. I'm talking about that kind of as like a metaphor, like the way that we think about the world and seeing that through rhythm. And as you can imagine, though I won't go into detail in this video, that influences the way that I write music as well and the way that I think about music and the like. Now, I think language is very open-ended, and I've always loved that aspect of language. And I've also always loved the form in writing, and by form I mean the way in which something is written, the kind of formal qualities that you're using, the kind of structure. And I find that to be very valuable. Often in my books I change styles, I change subject matter, I change themes, and I do that in order to kind of really branch out those possibilities and think about it in a deeper way, for me personally as a writer. And I like that, and I find it to be a valuable process. Because it's not really necessarily for me about establishing just one style. It's about establishing a way of looking at the world. So I like, for example, in philosophy you can get the idea of argumentation and of varying arguments as always being opposed, contradictory, dichotomous, as well as even antagonistic to each other. And so when I write a book such as, say, Cognitionales, where I'm focusing on a very intense narrative where language is less important, even though I might think about the beauty of language and the language I'm using, the language is just a tool to get to where I'm at. It isn't everything. And I think that that's very important to have. But for the book I'm writing now, Infinity Loop, I'm trying to write language as a code. And so I'm exploring what language can do on a very specific level, on a very ground level of what language even is. And that's a very contrasting thing because those are very different things to focus on. You could take one of my books for poetry that I'm writing now called Impressions, where the point is to write poems that are very basic in their form and structure, to be able to use language in a very simple way, but to capture something beautiful and meaningful, to capture what could be called an impression. Compare that to something like Resistor or Rogue or Radical, where the writing is much more open-ended because I'm thinking about the formal qualities of my poetry and what I am trying to accomplish and what I can do with rhythm and beat and language, and how powerful that is. So I definitely like that aesthetic. I also wanted to say that imagination is one of the main components of what I am doing. Aside from possibility, I think those two go hand in hand, in fact. And I really think that imagination is why I write. I want to know what I can imagine. I want to know what could be imagined. I want to know what's possible. I want to know what we can do in the world and what we can have happen. And I really, really like that. I think that it gives my writing a sense of purpose and meaning, and it gives it a sense of structure and a kind of motif with which to go off of. And so I like that. And so part of that is, as you may know if you've read some of my novels, I gear heavily towards speculative elements, such as science fictional elements, which I did in such as even my first novel that I wrote that I completed called Away from Home, which is basically science fiction and fantasy. Cognitionalities was fantasy, as an example. Maybe you call it contemporary fantasy. And so there's a lot of elements. I even have a poetry collection. Most of my poetry is more language focused and rhythm focused, but it definitely focused on my collection, Believe the Impossible, focused on speculative poems. So literally writing poems with fantasy elements or something like that. And I really like that. And you can imagine why. Asimov, as an example, has influenced me with thinking about the world, thinking about what's possible, and he's done that through his fiction. And in fact, the first book in the Foundation trilogy was something that really influenced me when I read it, with thinking about what you can do when you imagine whole new worlds. And so that dovetails nicely with imagination and with all of the things that I try to convey. Now, writing helps me a lot, I will admit. Writing helps me more than I could ever possibly know. It gives me a way to channel my emotions, to channel my ideas, to channel the things that I care about into something meaningful. I try not to look at myself as being strictly prolific or strictly productive, even though sometimes you have to have that mentality to be able to write things. I instead try to see it as a creation, as something new, as something that hasn't been done before. And I suppose in that way, experimentalism has inspired me as well, to think about laying out a new course, to think about laying out a new possibility. And I really like that. So yeah, I'm Phoenix, and I hope that you enjoyed this discussion on my aesthetic. Definitely check out my books, which you can find on my author page at amazon.com/author/Phoenix_rises. There will be more content to come. As you may or may not know, I recently just published my book 1 in my trilogy of poetry, I, which I'm very happy about and proud of. You can find that book and more on my author page at amazon.com/author/Phoenix_rises. This is Phoenix, and yeah, thank you for watching.